Redshift here, doing my part to shift perceptions out of the pink and into the red. Okay, so in today's video I'm going to be reading I wanted to read a bunch of quotes from the book The New Case for Gold by Jim Rickards, but it's just way too long. So I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes from chapter 4, just chapter 4, and then I'm going to be making a little bit of commentary here and there. So yeah, hopefully you all like this. I think it's moderately instructive, especially if you're fairly new to gold and you don't know much about the manipulation of the price and stuff, and you want to learn, like, is the price really manipulated, and if so, how do they do it? Well, then this is the video for you. Okay, so but if you already know all about that stuff, you might not get much out of this, but whatever, like hopefully somebody will get something out of this. Okay, so it says, the paper market could easily be 100 times the size of the physical market. This means that for every 100 people who think they own gold, 99 of them are wrong. Only one of them is going to get physical gold when the panic begins. That kind of leverage is fine as long as there's a two-way market, as long as price action is not disorderly, as long as people are willing to roll over contracts, and as long as people don't insist on physical delivery. The leveraged paper system works fairly well. The problem is that a lot of those assumptions, even if true initially, can disappear overnight. More investors are demanding physical delivery. Central banks around the world are also demanding physical delivery from custody at the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. We've seen Venezuela taking back its gold to Caracas, Germany taking back its gold to Frankfurt, and smaller players like Azerbaijan taking their gold back to Baku. The paper market is geared to certain depositories in New York and London and bank intermediaries that are members of the London Bullion Market Association, or the LBMA. If you take the physical gold in New York and move it to Frankfurt, it reduces the floating supply available for leasing in New York. There is no well-developed leasing market in Frankfurt. The result of moving gold from New York to Frankfurt is to reduce the gold available to cover short positions in New York. That either increases systemic leverage or requires the short positions to be covered elsewhere in the physical market. With regard to the pure physical market, there are a number of revealing transactions going on. If you're a large buyer of physical gold, you will discover that you have to source the gold directly from refineries, which means there are no sellers in the secondary market. In a normal, healthy market, if I'm a buyer and someone else is a seller, a broker will find the two of us, buy from one, deliver to me, and earn a commission. Now what's happening is that there are buyers in the market, but few sellers. So the only way a broker can get gold is straight from the refinery. The backlogs at refineries are running to about 5 or 6 weeks. That's how tight the physical supply situation is. Little redshift aside here. I saw an interview, I think it was an interview that Danielle Cambone did with Peter Hugg and of Kitco. It was on the Kitco News channel on YouTube. And in that video, she did 2 interviews with him recently, and in one of them he said he's only ever seen it like this in the gold and silver market. He's an older guy, probably 70s, maybe even 80s. He's pretty old. 50s at the very least, but probably way older than that. He said he's only seen it like this a few times. He said, I think the first time was back in 87. I think he said 1987. The other time was in 2016. And now it's happening again, right? And this book was written in 2016, so that's why it's talking about that situation being that way at that time, right? So what I'm saying is, like, there's like a 30-year span between, the time before last that it happened, and the last time it happened, it happened 30 years after that first time, and then now it's happening again just 4 years later. So it seems like it's speeding up, and it's really, really tight again now, just like it was in 2016. So this is good and important to know, I think. Let's see here. Okay, so then he's talking about gold, and then there's a few pages later he says, so you would expect the dollar price of gold to go down on a strong dollar. The question he's talking about a totally different topic. The question investors have to ask is, can that last? Is that the new state of the world? The answer is absolutely not. The reason is that the U.S. has allowed the dollar to appreciate. The reason is that the U.S. has allowed the dollar to appreciate and allowed other currencies to go down because those countries needed help. The Japanese economy is desperate to get inflation. The European economy had suffered its second recession inside the global depression that started in 2007. The U.S. allowed the dollar to go up, allowing the yen and the euro to go down, thereby throwing them a lifeline of monetary ease in the form of a cheaper currency. Okay, so as Peter Schiff has said, little redshift side here, as Peter Schiff, I think it was, has said, A strong currency is actually good for your country, not a weak currency. Um, and I totally agree with them because the stronger your currency is, the more it's like gold. And then, the better this is for your country. Countries are so stupid these days, especially countries like Japan and stuff, but the US too. But especially other countries, they actually think that a weak currency is some kind of advantage. What they're doing is robbing their own people and calling it a good thing. Acting like, this is good for the economy, that they're robbing their own people. This just means less seed corn. More people are going to be having to be on the dole, be on welfare, Social Security, whatever the country's equivalent is. And then it's like, and then the government has more liabilities, all because they robbed the people in the first place. A weak currency is never an advantage. It's retarded. And the U.S., in my opinion, Rickards is wrong here. I don't think the U.S. is throwing them a lifeline. Everybody knows who's done any research into the IMF has watched the excellent channel, the corny but really informative channel, the Hypocrites. What was it called? The Hypocrite Twins. Yeah, I think that's what it's called, the Hypocrite Twins. This is one guy who plays like two characters, right? Like the conservative guy and then like the liberal guy. And sometimes he plays like the middle guy, like the Fed guy, right? And he like explains how like the Federal Reserve works and the IMF. Well, I'm not sure about the Fed. I think he has some videos on the Fed. He definitely has a video on the IMF. He's basically like an economics channel that explains how these entities work, right? It's a really good channel, really corny humor and stuff, but really, really good as far as being informative. He's obviously quite smart. But he doesn't get technical. It's easy to understand. It's a great, great channel. You should really watch it. It should be hugely popular. Probably if it weren't so corny, it would be. But anyway, like, how did I get on that topic? But anyway, what I want to say is that, anybody who's looked in, watched channels like his and knows about the IMF knows that the IMF makes predatory loans to people, to other countries, like African countries and other countries, right? They make these predatory loans. And like Rickard says elsewhere in the book, if you borrow $1, but you have to pay back $1, then you have to pay back $1 in the future. But that dollar, if it's inflated away, could be worth 50 cents, and thus it's easy to pay back. Or the dollar could have gone up in value. Now you got to pay back $1, but in effort amount of work you got to do to pay it back, it's like you're paying back $1.50. So depending on whether your currency goes up or down, this depends on whether your currency goes up or down, or whether your currency goes up or down in relation to the U.S. currency is more accurate, because U.S. currency always goes down over time, especially over the long term. Your currency, if it goes down in relation to the U.S. dollar, then this means that you're going to have to pay back more than you actually borrowed, and even more than interest. You know what I mean? Because of your currency having gone down in relation to the dollar. And the dollar is the world reserve currency and is the advantage of the petrodollar. So pretty much always other currencies are going to go down in value faster than ours. They're going to have more inflation, unless, of course, they're spending way, way less money than us. They have way smaller governments. But still, we make these predatory loans through the IMF, which is an American entity, essentially. It's even based in America. Their headquarters, the IMF, are on the East Coast, if I remember correctly, which I think Rickards mentions in his book. But anyway, the U.S. is not doing this to help other countries because they want a weaker currency and they need a weaker currency. No, we're doing it because we know a strong currency is better, and we know that they're being idiots for devaluing their currency faster than us, and so we're going to help them do it. Because we don't give a crap about them. You know what I mean? That's what it's about. It's not like we're trying to help them or something. You see, so I wanted to point that out, that I think Rickards is wrong about that. I wanted to read this part on the next on the next page, where it starts talking about price manipulation, and then it goes on to all these sections where it talks about the different ways they manipulate the price of gold. The first section says, when we see the dollar price of gold go down sharply in the absence of relevant news, we can reasonably be certain that the gold market is being manipulated. There is statistical evidence, anecdotal evidence, and forensic evidence to support this conclusion. Gold manipulation is not new. Consider the 1960s London gold pool, or the US and IMF dumping of gold in the late 1970s. There is more recent evidence, including sales by the IMF of 400 tons of gold back in 2010, that shows price suppression. Evidence of manipulation shows up in some recent academic studies as well. The manipulation is real. Okay, and then he goes on, and then I'll skip a whole big paragraph, and then I'll get on to the next part where he says dumping physical gold. The most straightforward technique for suppressing the dollar price of gold, and the most obvious, is to just dump physical gold. If you're a central bank, sell gold. That was done for decades, starting in the 1960s London gold pool, when members of the Bretton Woods system, including West Germany, the US, and the United Kingdom, took turns dumping gold on the London bullion market to suppress the price. Such efforts continued in the 1970s after Nixon went off the gold standard. Gold started that decade at $35 per ounce. After Nixon shut the gold window, it went up to about $42 per ounce. By January 1980, it hit $800 per ounce. On the path from $42 an ounce to $800 an ounce, the U.S. tried desperately and secretly to suppress the gold price with gold sales. This effort is described in chapters 9 and 11 of my book, The Death of Money. Between 1974 and 1980, the United States sold about 1,000 tons and prevailed upon the IMF to sell 700 tons. So together, the United States and the IMF dumped 1,700 tons of physical gold, about 5% of all the official gold in the world. This manipulation effort failed. The dollar price of gold skyrocketed to $800 per ounce in January 1980, despite the physical gold dumping on the market. So at the end of the day, the U.S. just gave up and let the gold price go where it was going to go. I found classified private correspondence, which has since been declassified, which is how he got it, from the mid-1970s among Arthur Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, U.S. President Gerald Ford, and the Chancellor of West Germany, all describing this physical gold manipulation. There was more manipulation all the way through the late 1990s, including the infamous Brown's Bottom, when Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the British Exchequer, dumped about two-thirds of the UK's gold on the market in 1999 at close to the lowest price of the past 35 years. Switzerland was also a major gold seller in the early 2000s. So for a long time, the way that major financial powers manipulated the price was by dumping physical gold. The problem is that eventually you start to run out of gold. Duh. The UK doesn't have much left. Switzerland has a fair amount, yet a lot less than it used to. The US decided it did not want to sell any more of its gold, but was happy for others to sell. Exactly, that's how the US is. Like I was talking about before, the US will encourage other countries to, devalue their currencies, but isn't going to do it itself. The US will encourage other countries to sell their gold, but won't do it itself. That's how the US is. The physical dumping eventually stopped because people realized it wasn't working. There were ready buyers and the manipulators were running low on gold. They had to resort to paper manipulation. Let's talk about how that works. Paper manipulation. The easiest way to perform paper manipulation is through COMEX futures. Rigging futures markets is child's play. You just wait until a little bit before the close and then put in a massive sell order. By doing this, you scare the other side of the market into lowering their bid price. They back away. That lower price then gets trumpeted around the world as the price of gold, discouraging investors and hurting sentiment. The price decline spooks hedge funds into dumping more gold as they hit stop-loss limits on their positions. A self-fulfilling momentum is established where sellers beget more selling, where selling begets more selling, and the price spirals down for no particular reason except that someone wanted it that way. Eventually, a bottom is established and buyers step in, but by then, the damage is done. Futures have a huge amount of leverage that can easily reach 20 to 1. For $10 million of cash margin, I can sell $200 million of paper gold. We know who the brokers on the floor and the clearing brokers are, but the market is still non-transparent because we don't know who the players actually are, those doing the buying and selling through the brokers. We don't know who the ultimate customer is. Only the brokers know that. So there is anonymity through the broker combined with high leverage. And by the way, I think those people shorting gold through the broker anonymously are the government. Why wouldn't it be? You know what I mean? And then I'll skip a few paragraphs, and then the next page says, one result of such activities to take the gold out of the ETF warehouse, reducing the floating supply. The floating supply is the gold available for trading to support the paper gold. If gold is in a bullion bank or a GLD or COMEX warehouse, it's part of the floating supply and available to support paper trading. Once it gets to China and goes into a Shanghai vault or a Loomis vault in Switzerland, it's no longer part of the floating supply. It's part of the total stock, yet it's not available for trading or other transactions such as leasing and forward sales. Importantly, the gold in Fort Knox or at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or COMEX may be leased or leveraged if it's not being sold outright. The Chinese are buying gold that's not going to see the light of day for an indefinite period because they're putting it in deep storage. Once it goes to China, it's not coming back out again. The Chinese are not day traders or flippers. They're buying enormous amounts of gold and putting it in storage where it will stay. Taking all these flows into account reveals that more and more paper gold trading is resting on less and less physical gold. The inverted pyramid of paper gold contracts is resting on a small base of physical gold, and that base keeps getting smaller as the Russians and Chinese accumulate gold. By the way, I recently heard in an interview on Kitco News or somewhere else, maybe it was the Blind P channel, he hasn't put out videos for like 7 months, and a couple of weeks ago he started out putting out new videos regularly. He's probably put out, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 videos over the last couple of weeks. So yeah, you might want to check out his new videos, plus all his old videos. He's an amazing, amazing channel about gold and stuff. But anyway, yeah, he or someone else, maybe it was someone Danielle Cambone interviewed. Maybe it was Max Kaiser. You should watch that interview she did with him recently as well, a day or two ago or something. Max Kaiser or somebody said recently that I think it was Max Kaiser said that the Russians aren't buying gold anymore because they can't get their hands on it. And as Rickard says in this book, the Chinese, like this one huge provider of gold, like a Swiss refiner or something like that, they can't even give the Chinese all the gold they want. He has to be like, no, sorry, I can't give you as much as you want. I have other customers like Rolex and other people I have to sell gold to, right? Like the Chinese can't even get as much as they want to get. And now Russia can't even get any gold. So who knows what they're going to start buying? I don't know, maybe Bitcoin or who knows. But yeah, it's very, very telling. You know what I mean? Then on the next page it says, banks sell more gold than they have. If every holder of unallocated gold showed up all at once and said, please give me my gold, there would not be nearly enough to go around. Yet people don't want the physical gold for the most part. There are risks involved. There are storage costs, transportation costs, insurance costs. People are happy to leave it in the bank. What they may not realize is that the bank doesn't have the gold either. Because you're just, an unallocated owner of gold, which means they're going to settle your contract in paper dollars if there's no gold, right? And like he said earlier, it could be 100 to 1. So, for every 100 ounces, quote unquote owned in an unallocated way, meaning your name is not attached to specific ounces, nor legally attached. So they may have 100 ounces in the vault. I mean, obviously way more. I'm just simple example here. 100 ounces in the vault, but they have, 1,000 or 10,000 people. Like it'd be 10,000 people. 100 ounces would be 10,000 people if the leverage is 100 to 1. 10,000 people all own 1 ounce of gold. Well, there's not 10,000 ounces. There's only 100 ounces. So this means that, only one person gets their gold, or everybody only gets 1/100th as much gold as they're supposed to get. You see what I'm saying? So this is unallocated. Most people own unallocated gold unless they buy the physical coins themselves, right? You can buy allocated and segregated gold. It's, segregated in the vault as, especially for you, and it's named. I think maybe the bars have specific numbers or the coins do or whatever, and your name's attached to that part of the vault. Or but segregation and allocation are different, but I think you want yours to be both segregated and allocated, if I remember correctly, if you want to hold your gold in a vault, because then you own every ounce. If you want delivery, it's not going to be a case of 100 to 1. You're not going to get it. You will get every ounce if yours is segregated and allocated. But most people own unallocated gold, especially if they own GLD shares or something like that. Which is just a share of a stock basically that's backed up by a tiny amount of gold. Not anywhere near enough for everybody to take delivery. Again, only 1% as much. Right, but yeah, so most people just want to keep it in the bank. What they may not realize is the bank doesn't actually have it either. A central bank can lease gold to one of the London Bullion Market Association banks, which include large players like Goldman Sachs, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, and HSBC. Oh, surprise, 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 surprise. Evil banks like JP Morgan, HSBC, and Goldman Sachs. JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs were heavily involved in the destruction of 2008, annihilating the global economy. And then HSBC, if I remember correctly, they were the ones who were convicted a few years back, maybe several years back, of laundering $850 million. I think it was 850. It was a huge amount. It was almost $1 billion worth. I think it was 850 or somewhere around there. $850 million worth of drug money. Drug money. And nobody did a day in jail. They were just fined by the U.S. government. Why? Almost certainly because that was, behind the scenes somehow connected to CIA's drug dealing. The CIA uses the banks to, smuggle the drug money, do the whole exchange. You need banks to be a drug smuggler. You know what I mean? Especially on a massive scale like the U.S. government does through CIA and collusion with the ESF, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, behind the scenes. Which is kind of almost like you could say the shadow version of the Federal Reserve, much more secret and perhaps more powerful too. Yeah, if you want to know about the ESF, there's I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 videos on it on this one channel that doesn't have any other videos other than those on YouTube. You should watch those videos on the ESF. It doesn't tell you nearly as much as you would probably want to know, but it does tell you a lot more than you would probably expect to find out about it, especially since you probably never even heard of the ESF before. But anyway, yeah, evil banks like, HSBC, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Citibank. I'm adding the evil part, right? Because as I said, they are evil. Yeah, so gold leasing is often conducted through an unaccountable intermediary called the Bank for International Settlements, right? So basically, there's like banks, and then there's like the banks of banks, which is like the central banks, like the Federal Reserve and other ones. And I think maybe the IMF is on that same level, or maybe the IMF is on the level above that, where it's like the IMF and the World Bank. And then above that, at the very tippy top, the very top of the bank pyramid, you got the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS. So he says, he's mentioning that. He says, it's conducted through unaccountable intermediary called the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, Bank for International Settlements, sorry. Historically, the BIS has been used as a major channel for manipulating the gold market and for conducting sales of gold between central banks and commercial banks. The BIS can take the gold it already leased from the Federal Reserve and lease it to commercial banks that are LBMA members. The commercial banks then have title to a certain amount of physical gold. They then sell 10 times as much to the marketplace on an unallocated basis. So you can see the leverage at work there. They can sell as much gold as they want, and they don't need to have any physical gold, just a paper title through the lease agreement. None of this is speculation. You can go to the Bank for International Settlements' annual report and look in the footnotes where it discloses the existence of lease arrangements with central banks and commercial banks. It doesn't mention the banks by name, but the activity itself is clearly disclosed. We know who the commercial banks are because they have to be LBMA members. And we know who the central bank lessors are, so there's no need for speculation about what's going on. Okay, and then he talks about how it has checkered history. It's like a tree house where, instead of children, you have central bankers hanging out without scrutiny or supervision. And then he says they meet in Basel. They're organized in tiers. There's like 50 members, and there's an inner group of 7 or 10 central bankers. The larger group gathers for certain meetings, but the inner group of 10 go off on their own, shut the doors, and make their own deals. Bank for International Settlements is the most non-transparent institution in the world. Even intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, suffer occasional leaks. Yet, BIS leaks are unheard of. So, I thought that was quite interesting. But then again, there's tons and tons of people in the CIA. There's hardly anyone in the BIS, especially the inner group. So that's probably why they're so able to keep secrecy, because there's way fewer members, so way less possibility for leaks. You know what I mean? And then the next page it says something about. Well, let me check here. Still, they don't tell you about their deliberations. There are no minutes released of what goes on behind closed doors, and no press conferences after the central bankers meet. BIS is the ideal venue for central banks to manipulate the global financial markets, including gold, with complete non-transparency. Okay, and this reminds me of Bilderberg, right? I don't think there have ever been any leaks out of Bilderberg either, right? And then it says combining manipulations. You can combine manipulations. Let's start with an LBMA bank dealer. That dealer sees there's demand for physical gold in China, and there's gold in the GLD warehouse in London. Here's what it can do. First, go into the futures market and slam the gold price. This spooks the little guy who starts selling his GLD shares, driving down the share price. Meanwhile, the smart money sees a good entry point. The little guy is dumping his GLD shares while the big players are buying physical gold. Momentum opens up the spread between physical and GLD shares. The LBMA dealer next sells physical gold short to China. The dealer then buys shares from the little guy who's scared to death. The dealer redeems the shares, gets the physical gold, delivers it to China, and pockets the difference. So a dealer can create its own supply, create its own arbitrage, and then profit from the difference. Nice little scam they got going, huh? Those rich people. Okay, and then the next little subchapter says, who's behind the manipulation? We've looked at how manipulation works, how it used to be done in the physical market, how it's being done today, primarily through COMEX, ETFs, hedge funds, and leasing and unallocated contracts. The next questions are why and who's behind the manipulation. The LBMA banks are in it for the arbitrage and dealing profits, and the hedge funds are in it for the momentum profits. Yet there are larger political and policy interests involved. There are two players in the world with a strong motive to suppress gold prices, at least in the short run. One is the US and the other is China. Many observers have a naive and, in my opinion, mistaken analysis of the Fed's interest here. Observers assume that the Fed wants to squash the gold price to give an impression of dollar strength. In reality, the Fed wants a weaker dollar because it's desperate for inflation. It doesn't want the dollar to go away or collapse, yet a cheaper dollar will cause imports to cost more, which helps the Fed to meet its inflation targets. The United States is a net importer. A cheaper dollar means import prices go up and inflation feeds through the supply chain in the United States. I guess this is to deal with our insane debt and our insane deficit, maybe, because you're defaulting on your debt as you increase inflation. You see, because you're paying back the dollars, but you're paying it back with devalued dollars. So you're paying back less purchasing power than you borrowed. Hence the tendency for nations to want inflation, because it makes it so they don't have to pay their debts. You see, it's just another way of defaulting. But I think he's wrong here. Yes, I am sort of naive, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm no expert. But it seems to me that I think he's wrong about the Fed wanting, he says he doesn't think that they want to squash the gold price to give an impression of dollar strength. I think they absolutely do. I think they absolutely do, and I think I talk about that later when I comment on another thing that he says, so I'll just kind of leave it at that until I get to that other part. Okay, and then maybe a page or two later he says, now let's consider the other major player, China. China definitely wants a lower price because it's buying gold, that is. It sounds like a paradox. China owns a lot of gold. Why would it want the price to go down? The reason is that it's not done buying. China probably needs several thousand more tons of gold before it catches up to the United States. It's precisely because China is still buying that it wants the price to stay low. This gives China a motivation to manipulate the gold price. The interaction of these U.S. and Chinese preferences has interesting policy implications. The U.S. Treasury, to some extent, needs to accommodate Chinese wishes because China owns several trillion dollars of U.S. Treasury notes. While the Fed and the Treasury want inflation to help manage the U.S. debt load, China fears the inflation will erode the value of its Treasury holdings. If inflation breaks out, China's incentive is to dump treasuries, which would raise interest rates in the U.S. and sink the U.S. stock market and housing market. The compromise between the Fed's desire for inflation and China's desire to protect its reserves is for China to buy cheap gold. That way, if inflation is low, China's gold won't go up much, but the value of its paper treasuries reserves is preserved. If the United States gets the inflation it wants, Chinese treasuries will be worth less, and gold will be worth much more. So China will still be fine. Having treasuries in gold is a hedged position that protects China's wealth, even as the Treasury tries to destroy U.S. savers' wealth with inflation. The solution for U.S. savers is to do exactly what China has done, buy gold. I agree with that. Like, the solution is to do exactly what China has done, buy gold, because then the U.S. cannot, steal your savings with inflation. Like, it very much, inflation allows both the government to default on its debts to foreign countries, and it also, at the same time, allows the government to steal the value of its own citizens' savings. But, they foolishly don't realize, the politicians, or they don't care, that, because they think they'll be retired and out of office by that time or whatever, but they either don't realize or they don't care that a nation is built on the strength of its people. Countries are much more prosperous and technologically advanced and have more safety and higher standard of living if their population has higher ratiocination ability, and if they have higher morality, and if they thus consequently have less political corruption, right? But my point is that a country, the people are the strength of a country, and the people's savings are the seed corn for a country. That's what's going to start the new businesses and create the new jobs and get the technology advanced, et cetera, et cetera. Keep unemployment low by employing people, by starting new businesses, et cetera. You see, so when you rob everybody's savings of your own country, you're actually sowing the seeds of your own destruction as a country, and that's what we're doing. Right? But I also want to point out he's wrong to call it, this is nitpicking, but he's wrong to say that, inflation destroys the U.S. savers' wealth with inflation. It doesn't destroy the value of U.S. savers' wealth with inflation. It steals the wealth of U.S. savers, with their savings with inflation. The value, it's not like burning crops where the food is destroyed. They're creating new money, which they spend for things. The government can spend that money on doing whatever, tanks or gold or whatever. The government can print up money and use it to buy things. So the government is getting that purchasing power that is being stolen from the savings of its own people by doing counterfeiting. So it's not destroying the value of U.S. citizens' savings. It's stealing it for itself. That's what it's actually doing. And as far as China, I think I'll talk about this later too, but I want to say that it's not like the U.S. is letting China do this. It's not letting China do this. It's checkmated, economically and politically by its own massive. U.S. is checkmated by its own massive spending, by China's long-term vision and China's unified purpose instead of petty political backstabbing and squabbling for short-term gain. China's not like that. They have scientific educations. So a lot of their politicians are highly scientifically educated. Like a PhD or a master's in chemistry or whatever. You know what I mean? Like they're very educated people. A lot of the Chinese are very scientifically educated, unlike our politicians who are just totally illiterate. I mean, not literally illiterate, but they're scientifically illiterate. They're morons. They don't really understand anything. The politicians are just backstabbing scumbags who don't even realize, perhaps, that they're selling the country down the river. So, yeah, it's not like. But yeah, the whole thing about why would you want to buy gold if the price is going down? Well, same thing as every citizen should want. They should want the gold price to go down because that means you can buy more next month. You know what I mean? You should want the silver price to go down. That's why silver got this huge shortage recently over the last few weeks because the price went down to what was it, 11.90 or 12 or something? I didn't catch it until days afterward or whatever. But I saw some videos that showed that just before I had checked the price recently, I had not checked the price in a while. It was going way down, like into the 11s or the $12 an ounce or something. It had gone insanely low. The price of silver had, and so it's like everybody, all the people who regularly buy were like, oh my God, look at how low the price is. I gotta, back up the truck and buy as much as I can. Take out a bunch of money on the credit card or whatever. Do whatever I can to get as much as I can for this short period of time when it's going to be way lower, and then the price goes right back up again. You know what I mean? So, same thing with China. China and the regular U.S. saver who's buying gold and silver, they have the same idea, which is, buy as much as you can while it's cheap. And the more the price goes down, the more you should be buying. The more you can buy and the more you should be buying. Greater percentage of your wealth should be going toward saving gold and silver when the price goes way down. Because the price is definitely going to go back up again because they can't keep it below the price of inflation forever. Below the price of mining, because of inflation. So it always has to go up with inflation over time, sooner or later. So, the smart thing is to buy even when the price is going down, especially when the price is going down, because it always has to go up again, So I wanted to read that page, and then several pages later, there's a page which says, abandoning the dollar. Oh, wait, son of a bitch. Gold is constant. Never mind, that was the, yada, 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 yada. Yeah, so do what China's done. Yeah, sorry, that was the next chapter. I wasn't going to read any of that. And then I'll just read the last couple pages, 2 or 3 pages or whatever, and then maybe I will comment on a little bit of that as well. So, yeah, and then it says, he says he's confirmed this whole thing about, the U.S. and China agreeing that China should be able to get more gold, right, and facilitating that. He says, this is an issue I've discussed with senior officials at the IMF and the Fed, and they've confirmed my understanding that a global rebalancing of gold from the west to the east needs to proceed, albeit in an orderly way. But like I said before, this is not because the U.S. wants China to have more gold so China can have a seat at the table or anything like this. No, it's because China is, they think long term. They've invested in loss. They've got us addicted to borrowing money from them, etc. And so now they basically have gotten so powerful. They've got this huge hammer to hold over our head, or a sword to hold over our head, and saying we could revalue gold at any time. They probably have way more than Rickards realizes. They don't probably have 4,000 or 5,000 tons. They probably have 20 or 30,000 tons. I'm not the one to say this. Other people online who know way more about this stuff than me have said this. Multiple people who get interviewed by Greg Hunter, and so watch his YouTube channel. And these people say, yeah, China could have 20 to 30,000 tons easy. And I believe it. I think they could probably at least have 10 to 15,000 tons. I think they probably at least have 15,000 tons, if not 20 to 30,000, because they're historical. They believe in tradition. They've been saving gold for thousands of years. They never ever stopped. They highly value tradition. That's kind of what makes up for their lack of creativity. Like we have creativity, we whites do, but we don't have the devotion to tradition that the Chinese do. So we forget our founding principles of this country. We become liberal communist idiots, and then our country collapses. They don't do that shit. They remember the principles that kept them rich and powerful, and makes it so that the Chinese empire always comes back. China has had multiple empires. as Jim Rickards or somebody had said. I think it was Jim Rogers. Jim Rogers said that, not Jim Rickards. This book's by Jim Rickards, but Jim Rogers in an interview with somebody said that China's had like multiple empires, and they seem to have the secret sauce, right? So they remember gold. They all save in gold. All the citizens, they all save in gold in China. They all know about gold. They all highly value gold, and so this is not. We're not letting China accrue gold because we're benevolent or because we think it's to our advantage. We're letting them accrue gold because we have no choice. They could destroy our economy by selling the treasuries. They've got us addicted to their debt, and they've been thinking long term, and they waste less money than we do, or they seem to, even though they waste a lot of money too. But yeah, so I mean, they're not trying to sustain a global empire with hundreds, almost 1,000 military bases all over the world like us. So they probably have much lower expenses. And if they don't, it's because they probably have greater tax revenue or something, because they have a way greater population than ours. Like 4 times our population or 5 times or something. So yeah, this is not some natural thing that the U.S. is okay with. We realize we're bleeding gold. We realize this thing is unsustainable. We're checkmated. We're screwed. We're like a person playing chess who has, he's guaranteed to lose in like 10 or 15 moves, but he's just playing it out anyway, knowing he's going to lose because he has no option. But he could just quit, but he's too stupid to quit. Maybe thinking maybe there's something I missed, so I'm just play out the game. And maybe I'll see something that I missed before, and I'll be able to turn this around, even though he rightly realizes that he is doomed and he is destined to lose in 10 to 15 moves. That's what the U.S. and China are in the position of. They're getting more powerful. We're guaranteed to lose. If we were smart, we would quit now, and we'd let them crash the dollar by selling treasuries, and then we'd start over. Because the earlier you crash and start over, the less you're going to be enslaved by China. They'd still win, and they still become the next new world hegemon, but we wouldn't lose quite as badly. But we're going to lose huge now because we're trying to play this thing out and acting like we could still turn it around, even though we can't. Even though theoretically we actually could turn it around. If America got back on a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard or something, and we had real, genuine, honest money again, not fake honest money like Bretton Woods, but real honest money. And like Bretton Woods agreement where the dollar is 40% backed by gold, but then we were spending even more than that. It's ridiculous. That's not a gold standard. That's fake sound money. If we had genuine sound money again, like a Bitcoin standard or something, that's totally unsubverted, or just let the people use whatever currency they want. And we cut the government by 99% and government spending by 99%, and we cut the laws by 99%, so everybody had massive freedom again, then yes, America could turn this around completely and become super powerful again. But we're too stupid, our politicians are corrupt, and we the public are too cowardly. And so that's not going to happen. Things are just going to get worse and worse. So, buy as much gold and silver as you possibly can, especially silver, which will be much, much more valuable long term. I'm talking like 200 to 400 years from now. Silver will probably be worth, like 10 times the price of gold or something. And then silver will be just, if your descendants all still have silver in like, 200 to 400 years, oh my God, they will be billionaires. They will be so rich. But anyway, so he says, what can individual investors do to weather the coming storm? It says the United States is letting China manipulate the markets so China can buy gold more cheaply. The Fed occasionally manipulates the market as well so that any price rise is not disorderly. Where does the manipulation end? What can individual investors do to weather the gathering storm? Beating the manipulation. When we hear about the enormous forces brought to bear on the gold price, with the U.S. on the one hand and China on the other, how does the individual investor stand up against such forces? There's an inclination to say, I can't win against those players, therefore it's not worth the risk of being in the gold market. In the short run, it's correct that you cannot beat them, but in the long run, you always will, because these manipulations have a finite life. Eventually, the manipulators run out of physical gold, or a change in inflation expectations leads to price surges that even governments cannot control. There is an end game. Okay, I want to totally agree with that, and that's why I always say if you're going to buy precious metals, be willing to hold them for decades. Don't buy thinking you might have to sell in 5 or 10 years. If you have to sell in 5 or 10 years, yeah, you might lose money. It might go down, or even if it goes up, it might not go up enough to cover the premium that you paid. Or you sell back at slightly less than spot if it's silver. You might lose money. You very well could lose money if you only hold it for 5 or even 10 years. But if you hold your silver or gold, especially if you hold gold, for like 40 to 50 years, even just 30 years, you're almost certain to save a hell of a lot of money from having saved yourself from a lot of inflation, because the gold having gone up a lot and the dollar having gone down a lot in that time, in that 30 to 50 year period. So hold it for decades and you will always win. Um, History shows manipulations can last for a long time, yet always fail in the end. They failed in the 1960s London gold pool, with the US dumping in the 1970s, and the central bank dumping in the 90s and the early 2000s. The gold price went relentlessly higher, from $35 an ounce in 1968 when the London gold pool failed, to all the way to 1900 per ounce in 2011, the all-time high. There are new forms of manipulation going on now, yet ultimately they always fail. The dollar price of gold will resume its march higher. He's right, it will. They will ultimately always fail. The other weakness in the manipulation scheme appears in the use of paper gold through leasing, hedge funds, and unallocated gold forwards. These techniques are powerful. Still, any manipulation requires some physical gold. It may not be a lot, perhaps less than 1% of all the paper contracts. Yet some physical gold is needed. The physical gold is also rapidly disappearing as more countries are buying it up. This puts a limit on the amount of paper gold transactions that can be implemented. For example, the manipulation that took place in 2013, when the GLD warehouse disgorged 500 tons of gold, could not be replicated because by 2014 there were only about 800 tons of gold left in GLD. If GLD were to disgorge another 500 tons, there would not be enough gold left in GLD to make the ETF financially viable for the sponsor. There comes a time when the amount of gold left is so small that the management fees don't cover the cost of insurance, storage, administration, and other expenses. The third point to consider is that there is an endgame that arrives when China has enough gold so that its gold to GDP ratio equals or exceeds that of the US. It's not there, yet once it is, there will be no political reason to buy more. China will have secured an equal voice at the table the next time a Bretton Woods-style conference is needed to restore confidence in the international monetary system. Once China has enough gold, the US and China together could let the gold price go wherever it wants in an orderly way. Inflation could get out of control and China would not lose. If inflation and the gold price skyrocketed right now, China would be left in the dust. It doesn't have enough gold to hedge the portfolio losses on its treasury holdings. With the gold price soaring and the Chinese economy growing faster than that of the US, China would never catch up in hitting a gold to GDP ratio target. Okay, let me I'm almost done. Only a couple short, moderate-sized paragraphs to get through till I'm all done, but I want to make a little commentary on this as well. My commentary is that he says that it would not be enough if the gold price soared to hedge their portfolio losses, that is, the loss in value of their treasuries that they hold. $1 trillion or more than $1 trillion. He said several trillion or a few trillion, but last time I checked, I thought it was slightly less than $1 trillion in U.S. debt that China held. But whatever. The point is they have a fair amount of our debt, and that debt would be wiped out or greatly devalued, but yet their gold would not be enough to cover it, would not go up enough to cover that. Well, I say that it really depends on how much gold goes up. I mean, yeah, maybe if gold goes up to, $3,000 or $5,000 an ounce, I don't know, maybe that would not be enough to cover the portfolio losses on the treasury holdings, But what if gold went up to $50 or $100 or $300,000 an ounce? Then that would be definitely enough to cover their losses on their portfolio, on how much, U.S. debt they have in the form of dollars, in the form of bonds, So really, this assumes that gold would go up to just, 5 to 10,000 an ounce, which Rickards has talked about before. But I think gold could very well easily go up to, 50,000, 100, even, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 an ounce, easily. And so it really is the case that I think China, I don't think, really has to keep acquiring more because they're worried about losing their value of their treasuries that they're holding. No. China, like I said, they know history. They believe in their history. They believe in history, and they always follow tradition. And so what they're doing is just amassing gold because gold is money. And when they have that 8,000 tons to equal the U.S., assuming the U.S. even has that much, which I don't think they do. I saw some video about how that made the claim. I didn't really back it up enough or anything, but I believe it. Which is that Clinton was selling off a bunch of our gold in the 1990s. That's not acknowledged. That's not proven, but I bet you anything he was. And if he was, then, I don't think we have anywhere near 8,000 tons. I bet we have way less than 1,000 tons. I would not be the tiniest bit surprised to learn if we had less than 500 tons, or even less than 100 tons left. I think that 8,000 tons that the U.S. supposedly owns is almost entirely gone. And I'm not saying it all went to China or anything. I think we, disgorged it to various people over, decades. But whatever. The point is, I don't think China's amassing gold so they can just have a seat at the table at the IMF. No, they did that, and they have a seat at the table. But, the IMF was supposed to disclose how much China gold, how much gold China had when China joined. But guess what? They didn't disclose. They're supposed to, but they didn't, which means that the amount of gold that China has is scary and is way more than anybody thought. China told them the real number for the first time that of how much gold they have. And the IMF, once it learned the real number of how much China had, 20, 30,000 ounces, whatever China really has, who knows? Like, the IMF was terrified and was like, we cannot release this information. This information alone would shake the foundation of the world and would utterly annihilate America. We would lose all confidence. The dollar would lose all confidence. Everybody would sell off the dollar. It would annihilate the economies of the world. China would immediately become the world hegemon. That we can't release this information. So I'm certain that is what happens. So China's not amassing gold just to equal us. They're amassing gold because they're never going to stop amassing gold. But eventually they'll maybe stop amassing as much as a country, but I mean as a government, but like as a country, as the people, all the people of China save gold. They're going to continue saving gold. And China's probably going to institute some new crypto that's basically the modern equivalent of the petrodollar that parasitically feeds off the whole world. And then they'll be able to stay rich for free. And with some of those free money that they're making with that crypto that works to their advantage through technological infrastructure that's built to help them, just like how SWIFT was built to help us, because we control it, that international payment system, they'll build up some technology infrastructure that mainly benefits them, that they have control over, and they'll use that leverage to, institute a crypto that benefits mainly them, and they'll use some of those proceeds to buy gold maybe. So maybe they'll even keep acquiring gold with their crypto, even though they'll run the world on that crypto that'll benefit them, and then they'll just keep that gold at 20, 30,000 tons, whatever it is, in storage forever, basically. So I think that's what's actually happening. They're not trying to get at the table. They're trying to get as much gold as they can, and they're never going to want to stop. And there's no reason they will have to once they become the world hegemon, assuming they continue being frugal or whatever and wise. And then it says China would never catch up in hitting a gold to GDP target. Yeah, again, assuming gold only went up to 5 or 10,000. If it went up to 500,000 an ounce, which it easily could, then yes, China would never have. And assuming U.S. has hardly any gold, then yeah, China wouldn't have to. And assuming maybe China's way more than it says, which it almost certainly does, then yeah, Rickards, what he says here is totally irrelevant, China is buying as much gold as it can, but because it's trying to target a gold to GDP ratio and is the fastest growing major economy in the world, it's a moving target. The price has to be kept down until China has enough gold. When it's done buying, when it has approximately 8,000 tons, the US and China can shake hands and both say they're protected. At that point, a dollar devaluation by a rise in the dollar price of gold can commence. Again, like I said, I think that's irrelevant because the U.S. does not have the gold it claims, I'm almost certain, and China almost certainly has way, way more than anybody imagines that they have. But yeah, this is an interesting point, which a lot of people already know, but I'll mention it here, which is that because they have a much greater population, they have to amass a much greater amount of gold to have as much gold per person as other economies have. If we had that 8,000 tons and they had 8,000 tons, we still have essentially way more gold than them because they have a way greater population. So they should have as many times more gold than us as they have citizens. If they have 4 times as many citizens as us, to be our equal, they really should have 4 times as much gold as us. You see, and because Russia has way fewer citizens than China, it can have a way smaller amount of gold and still at the same time be just as rich as China. You see how that works? So that's important to know. And then he goes on to say, my advice to investors is that it's important to understand the dynamics behind gold pricing. You need to understand how the manipulation works, what the end game is, and what the physical supply-demand picture looks like. Understanding these dynamics lets you see the end game more clearly and supports the rationale for owning gold even when short-term price movements are adverse. Okay, I probably should have read the whole entire chapter front to back, not missing any portions, but I knew this video was going to be really long as it was, and they tend to be even longer than I expect them to be, the videos, and so I just mainly read the highlighted portions and a few other portions besides, but I really probably should have read the whole thing. But if you liked these excerpts and you thought this was interesting stuff, you really should read his book. I mean, obviously I don't get anything out of promoting his book, just, more aware subscribers out there buying gold and therefore waging economic warfare against the U.S. government while saving themselves. So, I think everybody should read this book, The New Case for Gold. I own it, but, you could probably get it at the library and then you won't have to buy it, or you can maybe, find it in the bookstore and then, read it for a few hours. Sit down at Barnes & Noble and just read once they reopen, if they're closed at your area, in your part of the country or whatever. But my point is, this is a pretty good book by Jim Rickards, called James Rickards. I mean, he goes by Jim, but The title on the cover of the book is James Rickards, and he's written other books like Currency Wars and The Death of Money, and he has a new one coming out, I think, next month or sometime really soon. So I've only read this one book by him. I'm sure all his books are good. I didn't appreciate this book as much the first time I read it, but I've been sort of rereading a little bit of it and stuff and realizing that it's actually way better than I thought it was. So you should totally read this book, and I hope the commentary kind of enlightens you on some of the things that I think he's a little bit wrong about, despite the fact that he's very knowledgeable and understands the stuff a lot better than I do. I think he's missing some of the practical, real world, view that you have when you're more cynical than he is. And he only recommends that people have 10% of their wealth in gold. This is idiotic and totally against what the data says. As I've said before, Belang P's videos, that guy's super smart, and he's pointed out that the data proves that having like 30 to 60% of your wealth in gold and having the rest in stocks or bonds or something is actually the best allocation, not just a mere 10%. So really, people should have way more money in gold than just 10%. And Rickards is like, if you're more aggressive, you could have as much as 20%. And I'm saying, no, the data shows, according to Belang P's videos, what he showed, that actually having way more than 20%, at least 30%, is a better allocation, way better. Historically speaking. But of course, because the upcoming crash, it'd probably be way wiser to even have way more than that. It'd probably be wise to have, 70% of your money in gold. But then again, you got to have a certain buffer in cash for emergency expenses. So you don't have to dip into the gold and then lose money on the premium and all that and stuff. Although it depends on how much gold you bought, because the bigger the piece you buy, the lower the premium you're paying, and the lower the premium you're paying, the less of a loss you're going to take. The shorter of a period of time you can hold it before you can sell it again and not lose money. Assuming it's slowly, gradually going up in value. But yeah, I'm going to talk in another video about how silver is a much better investment long term. I just kind of touched on it a little bit. Not any of the reasons per se. I'm going to go into the reasons of why silver is a better investment long term. Mainly that it's going to become more scarce, gold won't, and crypto will take the place of gold as everything is backed by gold. I mean, everything backs cryptos that's real, and yet the cryptos are totally practical, even though they're backed by unpractical monies that could have never been money in the past. Like argon, timber, lead, mercury, things that could never be money in the past will now be able to be money because those things will be backing cryptos. So there'll be tons of cryptos like that. This will make gold basically irrelevant, other than its industrial uses, which are not many. Silver will become the new gold, and it'll be becoming rarer and rarer and rarer as it's destroyed, through the industrial processes. So silver will become worth an astronomical amount of money, even in just probably 100 years, much less 200, 300, 400 years, when it'll be worth even more, just insane amounts of money, probably millions of dollars an ounce, or what would be like, not in devalued dollars, $1 million. I'm talking like what you could buy with $1 million today. You could probably buy that much with 1 ounce of silver in like a couple hundred years. So, definitely probably in 300 or 400 years. So, yeah, I wanted to say that. I'll probably say all that again, but in more detail a little bit. But that's basically the gist. I'll say that in another video that I've written the script for. But yeah, I think that was basically all I had to say in this video. Hopefully someone got something out of this. Hit the thumbs up button if you liked the video. Hit the thumbs down button if you hated it. Peace trucks.